Ata is a small, uninhabited island in the southern Pacific Ocean. It lies roughly 160 kilometers southwest of Tongatapu, the main island of the Kingdom of Tongatapu. From a distance it appears as a low rise of dark volcanic rock, edged by steep cliffs and broken only by a few narrow landings. Where the sea allows approach, the island covers less than 2 square kilometers. Its interior rises gently toward a central plateau, where soil has accumulated enough to support vegetation. Grasses, shrubs, and scattered trees grow unevenly, shaped by wind and salt. Fresh water is scarce. There are no permanent streams, only shallow basins where rain collects temporarily before evaporating or seeping into the ground. Ata had not always been empty. In the 19th century, it supported a small community. That settlement ended abruptly in 1863, when slave traders abducted most of the population. The island was abandoned afterward and never resettled. Over time, structures collapsed and paths disappeared. What remained was land returning to unmanaged growth. By the 1960s, Ata existed outside regular human activity. Fishing boats passed at a distance, but few stopped. It had no harbor, no markers, and no reason to attract attention. It was absent from shipping routes and largely forgotten in daily life. The climate was warm and humid, moderated by ocean winds. Weather patterns were generally stable, though sudden changes were possible. The island offered shelter from wind in some areas and exposure in others. It provided resources, but only to those who could recognize and use them. For years, Ata remained unchanged. It did not anticipate visitors. It did not signal danger. It waited, unnoticed, as it had for decades. In 1965, Tonga was a small island kingdom with a strong sense of community and routine shaped by church, school, and extended family. Tongatapu, the main island, held the capital, Nuku'alofa, where institutions and daily life were concentrated. Beyond the town, the country was ocean in distance. Travel between islands depended on weather, local boats, and schedules that did not always run on time. The sea was familiar, but it was not treated casually. The 6 boys at the center of the story were students at St. Andrews, an Anglican boarding school in Nuku'alofa. They were teenagers, aged roughly from early teens to late teens. Accounts identify them as Luke Vekoso, Sean Fatawa, Kolo Fikatoa, Mano Sean Filipaitato, and 2 boys commonly referred to in reporting as Stephen Tevita Fatai Latu and David Tevita Siola A. Spellings vary across sources, but the group and the setting are consistent. 6 students, living under a strict schedule, in a supervised environment, on the main island. Their decision to leave was not framed at the time as a survival problem. It was an attempt to escape boredom and rules, and to reach a different place by sea. Later retellings often describe a general plan to travel beyond Tongatapu, sometimes toward Fiji or New Zealand, but the historical record does not support a detailed, reliable itinerary. What is clear is the lack of preparation. They did not depart with the equipment, supplies, planning that an open ocean trip required. They stole a small boat reported as around 24 feet long and left in June 1965. It was not taken as part of a formal voyage. It was taken quickly, and their first decisions were improvisations. The boat was capable of coastal travel, but it was not stocked for days at sea, and the boys did not have the redundancy or navigation tools that would have made the risk manageable. This matters because it defines the character of what follows. The story is sometimes compared to fictional castaway narratives, but the reality begins in a recognizably ordinary place: teenagers in a controlled school environment, drawn toward the freedom represented by a boat and an open horizon. Their world was structured, their skills were partial. They were young enough to believe distance could be crossed by will, and old enough to handle basic tasks once conditions demanded it. At the moment they left Tongatapu behind, the sea still seemed like a route rather than an obstacle. The boat was moving, Lane was still within the wider region. The decision felt reversible, but it depended on one condition they did not control: that the boat would remain functional and the weather would remain forgiving. In the Central Pacific, those assumptions can fail quietly, without warning, and without any immediate second chance. The boat left Tongatapu without ceremony. There was no departure time recorded, no notice given, and no expectation on shore that 6 students would fail to return. Small vessels moved regularly along the coast, and the absence of one did not immediately suggest an emergency. Once underway, conditions changed quickly. The boys had no reliable navigation instruments and limited experience beyond coastal travel. Wind strength increased, and the boat was pushed farther from land than intended. With each hour, familiar reference points disappeared. The sea no longer served as a route between places, but as a widening separation from them. At some point during the night, a storm developed. Accounts differ on its severity, but the outcome is consistent. The sail tore, control was lost. Without propulsion or effective steering, the boat drifted. The boys attempted to manage what remained of the rigging, but there was little they could do. Exhaustion set in as the vessel moved without direction. Drift replaced travel. The boat was no longer going somewhere. It was being carried. For several days, the boys remained aboard, exposed to sun and rain, with minimal food and water. There was no way to signal for help. They did not know where they were, only that land was no longer visible. Eventually, the outline of an island appeared. It was not identified at the time. There was no map reference, no confirmation of location. The island was simply there, dark against the horizon, solid enough to suggest an end to drifting. Reaching it required effort. The damaged boat could not be maneuvered precisely, but currents and wind brought it close enough for the boys to swim ashore. The landing was uncontrolled. Waves drove the boat against rocks. The vessel broke apart and became unusable. Whatever supplies remained were left behind or lost to the sea. When the boys reached land, they did so without tools, without shelter, and without certainty that anyone knew where they were. The separation from the boat marked a final shift. The sea, which had first enabled movement, now formed a boundary. Return was no longer possible. The island was not a destination chosen in advance. It was the only place available. Only later would it be identified as Ata, an uninhabited island abandoned for more than a century. At the time, it was simply land-isolated, unfamiliar, and silent. The boys had crossed into a situation that could not be undone. The first days on Ata were shaped by immediate needs rather than long-term thinking. The boys had reached land, but arrival did not resolve the situation. There was no shelter, no tools, and no clear understanding of what the island could provide. What they did have was time, and the absence of any immediate alternative. The island's terrain imposed limits quickly. Steep cliffs surrounded much of the shoreline, making movement along the coast difficult. The interior was more forgiving, with patches of soil and vegetation, but reaching them required climbing and caution. Without footwear suited for the terrain, injuries were a constant risk. Movement was slow and deliberate. Fresh water was the first priority. Initial exploration revealed no streams or springs. Rainfall, when it came, was brief and unpredictable. The boys learned to watch the sky and to use natural depressions in the rock to collect water. Leaves and hollowed wood were repurposed as containers. Each rainfall was treated as an event rather than a background condition. Water was consumed carefully, with an awareness that the next opportunity might not come soon. Food followed. Early attempts relied on what could be gathered easily: coconuts, birds, and fish caught near shore. Fishing was inconsistent, limited by the lack of proper tools. Over time, the boys experimented with sharpened sticks and makeshift lines. Success varied. When food was available, it was shared. When it was scarce, intake was reduced without formal discussion. The group adjusted collectively, without recorded conflict over distribution. Fire changed the situation. Initially it was absent. Attempts to create it failed repeatedly. Eventually, through persistence and trial, they succeeded in maintaining a small fire using friction methods and dry material gathered from sheltered areas. Once established, the fire became central to daily life. It allowed cooking, reduced the risk of illness from raw food, and provided a psychological anchor. The fire was maintained continuously. Allowing it to go out was treated as a serious failure. Shelter developed gradually. The boys used fallen branches, palm leaves, and vines to construct basic structures. These were not permanent buildings, but adaptive spaces, adjusted as materials wore out or better designs emerged. Shelters were positioned to reduce wind exposure while allowing ventilation. During heavy rain, they leaked. During dry periods, they offered shade. They were functional rather than comfortable. Routine emerged without formal planning. Each day involved gathering food, checking water supplies, maintaining fire, and improving shelter. Tasks were divided informally, based on ability and condition. Roles were not fixed. If one boy was injured or ill, others compensated. This flexibility reduced pressure on individuals and allowed the group to absorb setbacks without collapse. Discipline was not enforced through authority. It developed through necessity. The boys avoided arguments by limiting decisions to what was required for survival. Disagreements, when they occurred, were resolved by returning to immediate needs rather than abstract preferences. There is no record of sustained conflict or hierarchy. Cooperation was pragmatic rather than ideological. Time was measured loosely. Days were marked by light and darkness, by weather changes, and by the condition of the fire. There was no calendar. Seasons were inferred through shifts in temperature and vegetation rather than dates. The absence of external reference points reduced anxiety about duration. The focus remained on continuity rather than rescue. Health was monitored informally. Minor injuries were treated with rest and improvised care. Serious injuries posed greater challenges. Without medical supplies, prevention mattered more than treatment. Risk-taking was minimized. The boys avoided unnecessary climbs and limited exposure to sharp rock. They learned which areas of the island were safer and adjusted their movements. Accordingly, The island itself became familiar over time. Paths formed through repeated use, productive areas were revisited, less useful zones were avoided, knowledge accumulated through observation rather than instruction. What worked was repeated, what failed was abandoned. This process was slow but effective. Psychologically, the group adapted by narrowing its focus. There is no evidence of sustained despair during this phase. The absence of constant reminders of the outside world reduced comparison. The island became the entire environment rather than a place of confinement. Survival tasks filled the day, leaving little space for speculation about outcomes. Occasionally, the boys attempted to signal for help. Fires were positioned where smoke might be visible from the sea. These efforts were intermittent and not relied upon. Ships did not pass close to Ada. The island's isolation remained unchanged. Over time, signaling became part of routine rather than expectation. Food production improved. Fishing techniques became more refined. Traps were attempted. Birds were caught using simple methods. Cooking reduced waste and illness. Nutrition remained limited, but intake was sufficient to maintain basic strength. Weight loss occurred, but it was gradual. One notable adaptation was the establishment of separate sleeping areas. This reduced crowding and allowed rest to be taken in shifts if needed. It also reduced tension. Privacy, even minimal, mattered over long periods. The boys recognized this without formal discussion. Firewood collection required careful management. Overuse of nearby resources forced longer trips inland. These trips increased risk but were necessary. The boys learned to balance immediate convenience with long-term availability. The island's resources were finite, but they were not exhausted quickly. Religious practice, common in Tongan culture, continued in altered form. Group prayers were held, not as a response to crisis but as part of routine. These practices provided structure rather than emotional release. They marked time and reinforced cohesion. The boys did not attempt to leave the island once established. There were no materials suitable for building a seaworthy vessel. Swimming away was not viable. But the decision was implicit rather than stated. Survival depended on staying. Over months, their condition stabilized. Skills improved, mistakes decreased, the island ceased to feel temporary. It was not home in a conventional sense, but it was manageable. Survival shifted from improvisation to maintenance. This phase lasted the longest. It did not involve dramatic events or sudden changes. Its significance lay in repetition. Each day resembled the one before, not because nothing happened, but because what happened was controlled. The boys had learned how to stay alive, and they continued to do so by not exceeding the limits they had discovered. Stability did not eliminate risk. Over time, the limitations of the island and the boys' physical condition narrowed the margin for error. Small failures carried greater consequences than they would have earlier, when strength and reserves were higher. One of the most serious incidents involved injury. While moving along the island's uneven terrain, one boy suffered a broken leg after a fall. The injury was severe enough to prevent normal movement. There was no way to immobilize the limb properly, no medication, and no means of evacuation. The group responded by adjusting routine. Rather than attempting treatment beyond rest and support, the injured boy was not isolated. Others brought food and water to him. Tasks were redistributed. Movement around the island slowed. The injury did not lead to abandonment or exclusion. Instead, it became a constraint the group absorbed collectively. Recovery was slow, but it occurred. This outcome was not guaranteed and depended on continued cooperation and restraint. Fire, which had become central to survival, also presented ongoing danger. Maintaining it required constant attention. At one point, the fire spread beyond its intended area and damaged shelter. There were no tools to control it quickly. The boys responded by clearing space and rebuilding afterward. The incident reinforced caution rather than panic. Fire remained essential, but it was treated with increased care. Psychological pressure increased during this period. The duration of isolation was no longer uncertain in the abstract. It was experienced as extended. Attempts to measure time became less frequent. The outside world receded further from daily thought. This reduced acute anxiety but increased a sense of separation. Weather fluctuations intensified strain. Periods of heavy rain alternated with dry stretches. Water collection was inconsistent. During dry intervals, rationing became stricter. Hunger was more pronounced. Weight loss was visible. Energy levels declined. Despite these pressures, there is no record of violence or lasting conflict. Tension was managed by withdrawal rather than confrontation. When disagreements occurred, individuals separated briefly, then returned to routine. The island allowed limited physical distance, which helped prevent escalation. At one point, the group split temporarily into smaller units to manage tasks more efficiently. This was not a breakdown of cohesion but an adaptation. The separations were partial and reversible. Communication continued. Loss during this phase was incremental rather than absolute. No one died, no single event ended survival. Instead, capacity eroded slowly. What had been manageable with surplus now required precision. Mistakes cost more. Recovery took longer. This phase marked the peak of vulnerability. The systems the boys had built continued to function, but only because they were used carefully. Survival depended less on innovation and more on restraint. They did not improve their situation. They worked to prevent it from worsening. In September 1966, after more than a year on ATA, routine was interrupted by a change that did not originate on the island. A vessel appeared offshore, close enough to be distinguishable from cloud or reflection. It was an Australian fishing boat, the Castaways, operating in the region. The appearance of the ship was not anticipated. The boys did not maintain a constant lookout by this stage. Visibility of passing vessels had been rare, and the island was not located along regular routes. The sighting occurred by chance rather than design. Response was immediate but restrained by physical condition and distance. A fire was lit in a visible area. Smoke rose above the island's edge. Movement toward the shore was deliberate, limited by uneven ground and fatigue. There was no certainty that the signal would be seen or interpreted correctly. The crew of the Castaways, led by Captain Peter Warner, noticed the smoke. Initially, it suggested recent human activity rather than habitation. Ata was known to be uninhabited. The decision to investigate was based on observation rather than expectation of survivors. Contact was made without incident. The boys were seen clearly once the vessel approached closer. Their condition indicated long-term exposure and adaptation rather than recent arrival. They did not attempt to swim out to the boat. The transfer was conducted cautiously. Identification followed. The boys were not shipwrecked fishermen or castaways from a recent disaster. They were students missing from Tonga for more than a year. The length of their absence was not immediately clear to those involved. Time had not been tracked precisely on the island. Transport of Ata proceeded without urgency. There was no medical emergency requiring rapid evacuation. The boys were weak but functional. They carried little with them. What remained on the island was left behind. Dot returned to Tonga and involved formalities. Initially, the boys faced potential charges related to the taking of the boat that had begun the journey. These were resolved without lasting consequence. Their survival became known, but it was not treated as a public spectacle at the time. Now rescue marked an end rather than a turning point. The systems that had sustained life on Ata were no longer needed. The island returned to absence. The boys returned to a society that had continued without them. The return from Ata did not close the experience in a clear or immediate way. Survival ended, but adjustment began slowly. The boys resumed life within families, schools, and routines that had continued in their absence. Their bodies recovered unevenly. Strength returned, weight stabilized, minor injuries healed. Some effects lingered without clear boundaries between cause and recovery. There was no formal record created at the time beyond what was required. The incident did not lead to institutional change or sustained public discussion. It entered local memory, quietly, outside the region. It remained largely unknown for decades. What distinguished the experience was not the scale of hardship or the novelty of technique. It was the absence of collapse. The boys survived without rescue plans, without equipment, and without authority. They did so by maintaining routine, limiting conflict, and adapting to constraint rather than resisting it. Ata did not become a symbol during the period that followed. It remained uninhabited. No markers were placed. The shelters decayed. The fire pits filled in. The island returned to the condition it had been in before, altered only temporarily by human presence. Later retellings sometimes framed the story as an exception. In fact, it aligned with known patterns of survival under isolation, cooperation, restraint, and attention to daily limits. There was no lesson that had not already been understood. The boys did not conquer the island. They did not master the environment that remained within it until circumstances changed. Survival was not achieved through transformation, but through continuity. When the experience ended, it did not demand interpretation. It remained what it was, a record of 6 people, staying alive in a place that offered little margin, long after return had ceased to be an option.